June 19th, 1944, 10 a.m. The Philippine Sea is a flat, blue mirror under a blistering sun. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Lexington, a single glowing line sweeps across a radar screen. Suddenly, a cluster of bright pips appears. They are 150 miles away. They are coming from the west. The radar operator calls out the bearing. The bogies are not a small scouting party. It is a massive strike force of over 60 Japanese aircraft. Then, more pips appear, and more. Within minutes, the screens are flooded with hundreds of incoming targets. This is the first strike the Imperial Japanese Navy has been planning for 2 years. They are coming to destroy Task Force 58 and save Saipan. Standing on the bridge is a small, weathered man in a long-billed baseball cap. Admiral Mark Mitcher doesn't flinch. He doesn't give a long, heroic speech. He turns to his staff and gives a simple, technical order. "Hey, Rube." This was the code for an immediate defensive scramble. In that moment, the greatest carrier battle in history began. The Japanese thought they had the advantage of range and surprise. They were about to fly into a wall of fire they didn't know existed. This is how Mark Mitcher turned a Japanese ambush into the most one-sided slaughter in naval history. By June 1944, the Pacific War had reached a tipping point. The Americans were no longer fighting for small jungle outposts. They were knocking on the front door of the Japanese home islands. The target was the Marianas, specifically the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. If the Americans took Saipan, they could build airfields for the new B-29 superfortress. From Saipan, the B-29 could reach Tokyo. The Japanese leadership knew this was an existential threat. They called the Marianas the Inner Defense Perimeter. To protect it, they launched Operation A-Go. They committed every available carrier, pilot, and shell to one decisive battle. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the Japanese mobile fleet. He had 9 aircraft carriers and nearly 450 planes. But standing in his way was the most powerful naval force ever assembled, Task Force 58. Task Force 58 was the operational heart of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It was commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher. Mitcher was not a traditional battleship admiral. He was an aviator who had been flying since the Navy's first wood and wire planes. He commanded 15 carriers, 7 heavy and 8 light. He had nearly 900 aircraft at his disposal. But Mitcher's advantage wasn't just in numbers. It was in technical coordination and integrated technology. His fleet was a massive, floating machine designed for one purpose: air supremacy. His carriers were surrounded by a steel curtain of fast battleships and cruisers. These escorts were packed with the new Bofors 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft guns. More importantly, they were equipped with the SK air search radar. This technology allowed Mitcher to see the Japanese long before they saw him. Mitcher's philosophy was simple: the pilot is the weapon. He spent his time ensuring his pilots had the best fuel, the best ammo, and the best planes. The plane of the day was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was built specifically to kill the Japanese Zero. It was faster, it was armored, and it was nearly impossible to shoot down. As Ozawa's planes launched from their decks 300 miles away, they believed they had the advantage. The Japanese planes had a longer range than the American planes. Ozawa planned to launch his strikes from beyond the reach of Mitcher's counterattack. He would use the airfields on Guam and Tinian as unsinkable carriers to refuel and rearm. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but it relied on an intelligence gap. Ozawa didn't know that American radar could now coordinate hundreds of fighters simultaneously. He didn't know that his unsinkable carriers on land had already been pulverized by Mitcher's bombers. And he didn't know that the American pilots were now far more experienced than his own. The Japanese pilots were mostly raw recruits with less than 100 hours of flight time. The Americans were veterans who had been training for this exact moment for years. The two forces were racing toward each other in the Philippine Sea. One side was relying on a traditional, decisive battle doctrine. The other was relying on a high-tech, integrated system of air defense. Mark Mitcher sat in his chair on the bridge, staring out at the horizon. He knew the Japanese were coming. He had been waiting for them to make the first move. The trap was set. The steel curtain was ready to drop. That steel curtain was not just made of metal and circuitry. It was an extension of one man's unorthodox command philosophy. Mark Mitcher was not the kind of admiral who looked good in a recruitment poster. He was a small, frail-looking man with skin that looked like wrinkled parchment. He rarely raised his voice and almost never gave a dramatic speech to his crews. His trademark was a long-billed, tan baseball cap that he wore even during the heat of battle. But behind this quiet exterior was the most aggressive naval aviator in the United States Navy. Mitcher was a pioneer who had been flying since the days of wood and wire biplanes. He was the pilot of the NC-1, one of the first aircraft to attempt a transatlantic flight in 1919. He understood the technical limitations of flight better than any other commander in the Pacific. He didn't view a carrier as a ship. He viewed it as a high-speed delivery system for ordnance. His command style was built on a single, unbreakable rule: the pilot comes first. Mitcher knew that a carrier's true strength was not its still hull or its anti-aircraft guns. Its strength was the 100 young men in the ready rooms waiting for the signal to launch. He obsessed over the technical details of their survival. He demanded that his carriers have the most efficient flight deck crews in the world. He timed the launch and recovery cycles with a stopwatch, looking for any gap in the process. If a pilot was lost at sea, Mitcher would move an entire task force to find him. This loyalty created a level of morale that was almost supernatural within Task Force 58. Mitcher's flagship was the USS Lexington, a massive Essex-class carrier. From its bridge, he managed an organization of over 100,000 sailors and 900 aircraft. This was a technical challenge that required a mind for complex systems. He had to coordinate the fuel requirements of 15 different carriers simultaneously. He had to manage the ammunition stocks for over 1,000 escorts and support ships. Mitcher relied heavily on his chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, a master of destroyer tactics. Together, they turned Task Force 58 into a precision engineer machine for air war. Mitcher was also an early adopter of Combat Information Centers, CIC. He understood that modern battles would be won by the men staring at radar screens in the dark. He insisted that every radar report be processed and relayed to his fighters in seconds. While other admirals were skeptical of new technology, Mitcher embraced it. He knew that the Japanese were still relying on visual sightings and voice radio. Mitcher had the advantage of the CXAM radar, which would detect planes from 150 miles away. He also had the advantage of the IFF, Identification Friend or Foe System. This allowed his controllers to tell the difference between a returning American scout and an enemy bomber. Mitcher's quiet demeanor was often mistaken for fatigue or illness. In reality, he was simply conserving his energy for the moments that mattered. He spent hours in a swivel chair on the bridge, staring out at the flight deck. He was a silent observer of the most complex military operation in history. He knew that Admiral Ozawa was searching for him in the vastness of the Philippine Sea. He knew that the Japanese were hoping for a decisive battle in the tradition of Tsushima. But Mitcher wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in efficiency. He was waiting for the Japanese to commit their planes to the sky. He knew that once they launched, they would be tethered to their fuel gauges. Mitcher had built a steel curtain of technology that the Japanese couldn't see. The silent admiral was about to let the machine do the talking. The radar blips were about to become a technical massacre. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was a man of cold, mathematical logic. He was the commander of the Japanese First Mobile Fleet. He knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer the dominant force it had been at Pearl Harbor, but he believed that he had found a technical loophole to defeat the Americans. His plan was designated Operation Ego. Ozawa realized that American carrier planes had a limited combat radius. The F-6F Hellcat and the TBF Avenger were heavy, armored machines. Their weight restricted their range to roughly 200 to 250 miles. By contrast, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was built for distance. It lacked heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. This made the Zero a flying glider, but it also made it incredibly light. A Japanese strike group could fly nearly 350 to 400 miles to reach a target. Ozawa decided to use this range gap to his absolute advantage. He would launch his planes from a distance where Mitscher's carriers could not strike back. This was the core of his outrange strategy. Ozawa also incorporated the islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian into his tactical web. He planned a shuttle bombing maneuver that looked perfect on paper. His planes would launch from his carriers, strike Task Force 58, and then land on the airfields of Guam. There, they would refuel, rearm, and strike the Americans again on the way back to their ships. This would effectively double the number of attacks the Americans would have to endure. Ozawa believed he was leading the Americans into a decisive battle trap. He had 9 aircraft carriers, including the massive new flagship, Taiyo. Taiyo was the first Japanese carrier with an armored flight deck. It was designed to survive the very dive-bombing attacks that had sunk the carriers at Midway. Ozawa also had the veteran carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku. But Ozawa's plan had 2 fatal technical flaws. The first was the quality of his software, his pilots. Japan had lost its best aviators in the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands. The new pilots were 3-month wonders, with barely enough training to land on a moving deck. They could fly in a straight line, but they lacked the technical skill for complex dogfighting. The second flaw was Mitscher's hardware, the radar. Ozawa assumed the Americans would be blinded by the vastness of the Philippine Sea. He didn't realize that Mitscher's Task Force 58 was a digital fortress. Every Japanese move was being tracked by the SK long-range radar sets. Mitscher also knew about the shuttle bombing plan before it even started. American submarines had been shadowing Ozawa's fleet for days. The USS Albacore and USS Kavala were already in position. Mitscher also sent his own bombers to neutralize the unsinkable carriers on land. While Ozawa was preparing to launch his shuttle, Mitscher was cratering the runways on Guam. The Japanese planes would arrive at the airfields only to find them filled with smoke and debris. Ozawa was playing a game of chess from the previous century. Mitscher was playing a game of electronic warfare from the future. The Japanese admiral gave the order to launch the first wave on the morning of June 19th. Nearly 70 planes roared off the decks of the First Mobile Fleet. They were flying into a technical trap they couldn't possibly understand. The outrange strategy was about to become a one-way trip into a wall of steel. The morning of June 19, 1944 began with a deceptive calm. Admiral Mark Mitscher sat in his swivel chair on the flag bridge of the USS Lexington. He was sipping lukewarm coffee. His long-billed cap shaded his eyes from the tropical glare. Deep within the ship's hull, the Combat Information Center, CIC, was humming with electronic life. The SK airstretch radar sent out invisible pulses of energy across the Philippine Sea. At exactly 10 a.m., a radar technician noticed a faint, flickering line on his cathode ray tube. It wasn't a single scout plane or a stray return from a cloud. It was a massive cluster of pips moving in a tight formation. The bearing was 250 degrees, and the distance was a staggering 150 miles. The technician relayed the data to the plotting officers at the central glass board. They used grease pencils to mark the position, speed, and heading of the incoming bogies. The math was clear. A major Japanese strike force was closing in fast. Within minutes, the radar detected a second wave, then a third, and a fourth. The Japanese were coming in a massive, coordinated shuttle strike. Admiral Ozawa had unleashed his outrange weapon. Mitchell received the report on the bridge via the ship's internal squawk box. He didn't panic or call for a council of war. He looked at his watch and saw that he had roughly 30 minutes before the enemy was in visual range. He gave the order that every American pilot had been waiting for, "Hey Rube." This was the traditional circus call for a fight, and in Task Force 58, it meant an immediate scramble. The flight decks of 15 carriers erupted into a symphony of mechanical chaos. Starters whined, and 2,000 horsepower engines roared to life, spitting blue flame into the humid air. The yellow-shirted flight deck officers used hand signals to guide the fighters toward the catapults. In less than 15 minutes, Mitchell launched over 450 F-6F Hellcats into the sky. This was a technical feat of logistics that the Japanese could not match. The American fighters didn't just mill around the fleet. They were vectored by radar controllers. The CIC acted as the brain of the fleet, whispering directions into the ears of the pilots. Vector 250, Angels 20, the controllers commanded. This meant the pilots were to fly at 20,000 feet to gain the altitude advantage. Mitchell kept his dive bombers and torpedo planes on the decks for now. He wanted the sky clear for his knights of the air to do their work. The Japanese pilots were flying in a rigid, traditional formation. They expected to find the American fleet unprepared and struggling to launch. Instead, they looked up and saw the sun glinting off the wings of hundreds of Hellcats. The radar blip had given Mitchell the one thing Ozawa couldn't afford to lose: time. The outrange strategy had been neutralized by a sweeping line of green light on a screen. The first wave of 69 Japanese planes was now only 50 miles away. They were about to meet the most lethal fighter plane ever built. The hunters were about to become the harvested. The Great Marianas turkey shoot was seconds away from the first trigger pull. The technical superiority of the Hellcat was about to be written in smoke and fire. And in that final second before the guns fired, the outcome was already determined by the sheet metal and hydraulics inside the cockpits. The battle for the Marianas was not just a clash of wills. It was a technical showdown between two fundamentally different philosophies of flight. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 had long been the undisputed king of the Pacific sky. It was a masterpiece of weight reduction and aerodynamic grace. The Zero was designed for extreme agility and massive range. But to achieve this, the Japanese engineers had sacrificed almost every form of protection. The Zero lacked armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a glass cannon that could dance around an opponent, but couldn't take a hit. Standing against it was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was built with a single purpose: to survive the Zero and then kill it. American engineers at Grumman had listened to the technical feedback from the early war. They created a tank with wings powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The engine was a twin-row, 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that could pull the heavy fighter through the air at 380 miles per hour. The Hellcat was protected by hundreds of pounds of cockpit armor and bullet-resistant glass. Its fuel tanks were lined with a self-sealing rubber compound that closed holes instantly. If a Zero hit a Hellcat with its 7.7 millimeter machine guns, the American pilot usually flew home. If a Hellcat hit a Zero with its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, the Japanese plane often disintegrated. The Hellcat also had a superior rate of roll at high speeds. A Zero pilot could outturn a Hellcat in a slow circular dogfight. But a Hellcat pilot could dive at high speed and roll away before the Zero could even react. This was the boom and zoom tactic that Mark Mitcher's pilots had mastered. The Hellcat was also a far more stable gun platform. Its wide-set landing gear made it safer to land on a pitching carrier deck. Its heavy frame meant it didn't vibrate when the pilot pulled the trigger. The technical gap between the two planes was widened by the quality of the fuel. American planes ran on high-octane 100-octane aviation gasoline. This allowed the Pratt & Whitney engines to operate at maximum compression without knocking. Japanese fuel was often of a lower grade, which reduced the performance of their engines. As the Japanese first strike approached Task Force 58, the technical imbalance was absolute. The Japanese pilots were flying in fragile machines they barely knew how to handle. The Americans were flying in rugged monsters that were virtually indestructible. The Hellcat wasn't just a better plane, it was a psychological weapon. When the Japanese pilots saw the blue ghosts diving from the sun, they knew their armor was zero. The steel curtain in the air was about to meet the one-shot lighters of the Empire. The technical superiority of the Grumman engineering was about to turn the sky into a graveyard. The slaughter was ready to begin. At 10:35 a.m., the first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft hit the American radar wall. They were still 50 miles away from the nearest American carrier. The American radar controllers in the CIC saw them as a solid mass of hostile energy. Vector 250, Angels 25. The controllers radioed to the orbiting F-6F Hellcats. The American pilots had been waiting at high altitude, their engines idling in the cold, thin air. When the command came, they pushed their throttles forward and dived. It wasn't a dogfight in the traditional sense. It was an interception orchestrated with the precision of a slaughterhouse. The Japanese pilots, many with only basic training, were overwhelmed by the speed of the attack. In the first few minutes, dozens of Japanese planes were splashed into the Pacific. Only a few managed to break through the fighter screen to see the American ships. Those few survivors then met the steel curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The new VT proximity fuses in the American 5-inch shells were a technical nightmare for the Japanese. These shells didn't need a direct hit. They exploded when they sensed the metal of an enemy plane nearby. The first wave was effectively erased before it could drop a single torpedo. Then came the second wave, the largest of the day with 128 aircraft. This was Ozawa's primary hammer, but it was shattered even more quickly. The American fighters intercepted them 60 miles out, high above the water. Commander Alex Vrachu, one of the Navy's top aces, downed 6 Japanese dive bombers in just 8 minutes. As he returned to the USS Lexington, he famously held up 6 fingers to his deck crew. The flight decks of the American carriers were a whirlwind of hot refueling and rearming. Hellcats landed, took on more 50 caliber ammunition, and they were back in the air in minutes. The technical efficiency of the deck crews allowed Mitscher to maintain a constant lid on the sky. The third and fourth waves fared no better. Many Japanese pilots, realizing they couldn't reach the carriers, tried to land at Guam to refuel. But Mitscher's bombers had already cratered the runways and destroyed the fuel pits. The Japanese planes were forced to circle helplessly until they ran out of fuel or were picked off. By the end of the day, the Japanese mobile fleet had lost nearly 300 aircraft. The Americans had lost only 23 planes in combat. A young signalman on the Lexington watched the carnage through his binoculars. "Why, hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot," he remarked. The name stuck, and the battle would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa's pilot corps, the result of years of investment, was gone in a single afternoon. The technical gap in radar and pilot training had turned a battle into a massacre. But the Japanese weren't just losing the sky. Beneath the waves, the silent killers were about to deliver the final, crushing blow. The Japanese flagships were already in the sights of American periscopes. While the Japanese were looking up at the Hellcats, they should have been looking down. Beneath the blue surface of the Philippine Sea, 2 American submarines were waiting in the shadows. These were the silent killers of the Pacific, and they were about to finish what the pilots had started. The first was the USS Albacore, commanded by James W. Blanchard. At 8 a.m., the Albacore had spotted the pride of the Japanese fleet, the flagship Taiyo. The Taiyo was a technical marvel featuring an armored flight deck and a massive complement of 65 aircraft. Blanchard fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the giant carrier from a distance of 5,300 yards. One of the torpedoes struck the Taiyo near its forward aviation gasoline tanks. To the Japanese, the hit seemed manageable at first. The armored deck had held, and the ship was still moving at 26 knots. But a catastrophic technical failure was brewing deep inside the hull. The explosion had ruptured the fuel lines, and highly volatile aviation gas was leaking into the lower decks. An inexperienced damage control officer made a fatal mistake. He ordered the ship's ventilation system to be turned on at full power to clear the fumes. Instead of venting the gas, the fans pushed the explosive vapors into every corner of the ship. The Taiyo became a massive floating bomb waiting for a single spark. 6 hours later, an electric generator sparked, and the flagship disintegrated in a massive internal explosion. While the Taiyo was dying, another submarine, the USS Kavala, was stalking the Shokaku. The Shokaku was a legend of the Imperial Navy and a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Commander Herman Kostler of the Kavala fired a precise spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 of them slammed into the side of the veteran carrier. The hits triggered massive fires among the aircraft that were being refueled on the hangar deck. The Shokaku lacked the sophisticated fire suppression systems found on American carriers. The Pearl Harbor Avenger watched through its periscope as the legendary carrier rolled over and sank. Ozawa had lost his brand new flagship and one of his most experienced carriers in a single morning. He was forced to transfer his command to a destroyer, losing almost all tactical control over his fleet. The loss of the Taiyo and Shokaku meant the outrange strategy was technically dead. Ozawa no longer had the decks to recover his shuttle planes even if they survived the Hellcats. The American submarines had neutralized the heart of the Japanese mobile fleet. Mitscher now had total control of both the sea and the sky. But the admiral wasn't finished. He knew the Japanese fleet was retreating toward the west. He was about to make the most dangerous decision of his career. He was going to launch a strike at sunset, knowing his pilots might never find their way home. The silent killers had broken the enemy's back. Now, Mitscher was going for the throat. By the late afternoon of June 20th, the Philippine Sea was littered with the charred debris of the Imperial Navy. But Mark Mitscher was not a man who settled for a partial victory. He wanted the remaining Japanese carriers, especially the veteran Zukaku. At 3:40 p.m., an American scout plane finally spotted Ozawa's retreating fleet. The distance was the immediate technical problem. The Japanese were nearly 275 miles to the west of Task Force 58. This was at the absolute physical limit of the American aircraft's combat range. A standard strike mission usually turned back at 200 miles to ensure a safe margin for landing. Launching now meant the pilots would be flying back in total, moonless darkness. They would also be landing with their fuel needles hovering precariously over the empty mark. Mitscher stood on the bridge of the USS Lexington and looked at the ticking clock. He knew the risks better than any man in the Pacific. He didn't hesitate or call for a committee. He gave the order to launch the strike. 216 aircraft roared off the decks in the rapidly fading light. It was a deadly mix of Hellcats, Helldivers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes. The pilots knew this was a one-way gamble for many of them. They flew west into the setting sun, their engines strained to maintain maximum cruising efficiency. Every gallon of high-octane fuel was a precious second of life. As they reached the Japanese fleet, the sky was turning a bruised, deep purple. The strike was frantic, fast, and incredibly violent. Despite the dim light, the Americans managed to sink the carrier Haiyo. They also hammered the Zukaku, and several destroyers with near misses and direct hits. But the real battle was only just beginning for the American aviators. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the pilots in a pitch-black void. They turned their planes back toward the east, searching for a fleet they could no longer see. They were still over 200 miles from home, and their fuel lights were beginning to flicker. In the 1940s, carrier landings were difficult enough in broad daylight. Landing on a pitching, narrow deck in total darkness was considered a technical suicide mission. Many pilots began to lose their formations in the gloom. Radios crackled with the voices of men who knew they were running out of air and time. Mitcher sat in his swiveled chair listening to the growing panic on the radio frequencies. He was about to make a decision that would break every standing rule in the Naval Handbook. He was about to choose his men over the safety of his ships. The dusk strike was about to become the night of the lights. The American pilots were flying through a wall of absolute darkness. Their fuel gauges were no longer an estimate, they were a death sentence. The vast majority of the 216 aircraft were within minutes of total engine failure. Panic began to seep into the radio channels as pilots searched for any sign of a wake in the black water. Standard naval doctrine dictated that the fleet must remain dark to avoid attracting Japanese submarines. Turning on a single searchlight was considered an act of tactical suicide for an aircraft carrier. Admiral Mark Mitcher sat on the bridge of the USS Lexington, listening to the voices of his boys. He knew that if he followed the rules, he would lose nearly every pilot he had sent out. He turned to his staff and gave the most legendary order of the Pacific War. Turn on the lights. In an instant, the dark heart of Task Force 58 transformed into a glowing city of light. Massive searchlights pointed straight into the sky, creating pillars of fire visible for miles. Cruisers fired star shells into the air to illuminate the horizon for the struggling aviators. The carriers turned on their deck lights, turning the narrow wooden strips into beacons of hope. It was a technical nightmare for the flight deck crews as planes from every different carrier scrambled to land anywhere they could find a deck. Fuel-starved Hellcats and Avengers were dropping onto carriers they didn't belong to. Some pilots, blinded by the glare or exhausted by the light, crashed into the island structures or missed the wires. 80 American planes were lost during the chaotic recovery, but only 16 pilots were killed. Mitcher's gamble had worked. He had saved the human engine of his fleet. By sunrise, the Japanese mobile fleet was in a full, disorganized retreat toward their home islands. They had lost the battle, the Marianas, and the entire future as a naval power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed the Japanese carrier arm forever. Mitcher's victory proved that technical precision and pilot loyalty win wars. The steel curtain of American radar and Hellcats ended the outrange threat. Japan would never again launch a coordinated carrier strike. Hit the like button for more technical breakdowns of naval history. Subscribe to see how logistics and technology shape the world. Leave a comment below. Do you think Mitcher was right to risk the fleet to save his pilots? Share your thoughts, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.